My name is Zara Castellanos, and what should have been the most beautiful day of my life ended with paramedics rushing me to the emergency room while my own sister watched from the crowd with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. 3 hours after cutting into my dream wedding cake, I was fighting for my life in intensive care, and within 48 hours, my FBI director father had launched a federal investigation that would tear our family apart forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my wedding dawned crisp and clear in Austin, Texas, with the kind of golden sunlight that photographers dream about. I stood in the bridal suite at Lakeside Manor, watching the sun dance across the water through floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling like I was living inside a fairy tale. My dress hung behind me, a cascade of ivory silk and delicate lace that had taken 8 months to design. Tyler, my fiancé of 3 years, was somewhere across the property getting ready with his groomsmen, probably nervous as hell, and checking his watch every 5 minutes like he always did when he was anxious. I should have been nervous too, but I felt nothing but pure joy radiating through every cell in my body. After years of careful planning, everything was falling into place exactly as I had envisioned. The venue looked magnificent, with strings of warm lights wrapped around ancient oak trees and tables set with lavender centerpieces that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. 200 guests had traveled from across the country to celebrate with us, including colleagues from the law firm where I worked as a corporate attorney and Tyler's medical school friends who had driven down from Dallas. My maid of honor, Indy Rodriguez, burst through the door carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the biggest grin I had ever seen on her face. She had been my roommate through law school and remained my closest confidant through every triumph and heartbreak of the past decade. Her dress, a soft sage green that complemented her dark hair perfectly, was already wrinkle-free despite the fact that she had been running around since dawn handling last-minute details. "Okay, bride-to-be," she announced, setting the coffee on the vanity table. "Hair and makeup will be here in 30 minutes. Your flowers just arrived, and they're absolutely stunning." And I just saw Tyler pacing around outside the groom's quarters looking like he's about to throw up from excitement. I laughed, accepting the coffee gratefully. He's probably rehearsing his vows for the 100th time. Last night he was muttering them in his sleep. "That man is head over heels for you," Indy said, settling into the chair beside me. "I still can't believe you two are finally doing this. It feels like just yesterday you were complaining about how he always left his surgical textbooks all over your apartment." The memory made me smile. Tyler and I had met during my 2nd year of law school when he was finishing his residency at the hospital. He had been exhausted, stressed, and completely dedicated to his work, but somehow we had found a rhythm that worked. He would study late into the night while I prepared for mock trials, and we would meet in the middle for quick dinners and stolen moments that gradually turned into something deeper than either of us had expected. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and my mother, Carmen Castellanos, entered carrying my bouquet. At 58, she still carried herself with the poise and elegance that had made her a formidable presence in Austin's social circles. Her navy blue dress was perfectly tailored, her silver hair styled in an elegant updo, and her smile radiated the kind of warmth that had always made me feel safe. "My beautiful daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she took in the sight of me in my robe and curlers. "I can hardly believe this day is finally here." She handed me the bouquet, a carefully arranged collection of white peonies, lavender sprigs, and eucalyptus that perfectly matched the vision I had described to our florist months ago. The fragrance was intoxicating, and I buried my nose in the blooms, feeling overwhelmed by how perfect everything felt. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing toward the door. "He's handling some work calls, but he promises to be completely present once the ceremony starts," Mom replied with a knowing look. "You know how he is about keeping the world safe." My father, Vincent Castellanos, had been the director of the FBI's Austin division for the past 8 years, a position that had brought our family both pride and scrutiny. His work often consumed him, but he had always made time for the moments that mattered most. When I graduated from law school, he had been in the front row cheering louder than anyone else. When I passed the bar exam, he had taken the entire family out for a celebration dinner that lasted until midnight. Another knock came at the door, and Brooke, my younger sister, peeked her head inside. At 26, she was 3 years younger than me, but had always carried herself with a confidence that sometimes bordered on arrogance. Her bridesmaid dress, the same sage green as Indy's, fit her perfectly, accentuating her athletic build and the auburn hair that she had inherited from our father's side of the family. "The photographer wants to get some shots of you with the dress before you put it on," she said, stepping into the room. "And Mrs. Hartwell is looking for you." Something about confirming the cake cutting time. Mrs. Hartwell had been our wedding planner, a meticulous woman in her 60s who had coordinated some of Austin's most elaborate celebrations. She had come highly recommended and had proven herself invaluable in managing the 1,000 details that went into creating the perfect wedding day. "Tell her I'll be right there," I said, standing up to hug Brooke. "Thank you for everything you've done to help with today. I know planning a wedding can be stressful for everyone involved." Brooke returned the hug, but something felt different about it. Her embrace was brief, almost mechanical, and when she pulled away, her smile seemed forced. I attributed it to pre-wedding jitters, knowing that big family events sometimes brought out unexpected emotions in people. "Of course," she said. "I just want everything to be perfect for you." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. The hair and makeup team transformed me into a version of myself that looked like it belonged in a magazine, with soft waves cascading over one shoulder and makeup that enhanced my features without feeling overdone. When I finally stepped into my dress, with Indy and my mother carefully managing the train and buttons, I felt a surge of emotion that nearly brought tears to my eyes. The dress fit like it had been painted on my body, hugging my curves in all the right places before flowing into a dramatic train that would photograph beautifully against the manor's stone floors. The lace sleeves were delicate and romantic, and the neckline struck the perfect balance between elegant and alluring. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I barely recognized myself. "Tyler is going to lose his mind when he sees you," Indy whispered, adjusting my veil one final time. As the afternoon progressed, guests began arriving at the manor. I watched from my window as cars pulled up the circular driveway, depositing elegantly dressed couples who made their way toward the ceremony space. I recognized faces from both families, old friends from college, and colleagues from the legal community who had become like extended family over the years. My father appeared in the bridal suite just as I was putting on my earrings, diamond studs that had belonged to my grandmother. He looked distinguished in his charcoal gray tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled and his eyes bright with pride. At 62, he carried himself with the authority that came from decades in law enforcement, but his expression softened completely when he saw me. "Zara," he breathed, stopping in the doorway. "You look absolutely radiant." I walked over to him, careful not to step on my train, and he pulled me into a gentle embrace that managed to avoid disturbing my hair and makeup. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured against my ear. "Not just today, but every day. You've become an incredible woman, and Tyler is the luckiest man alive." "Thank you, Dad," I whispered back, feeling tears threaten to ruin my carefully applied mascara. "For everything. For supporting me, for believing in me, for walking me down that aisle in 10 minutes. He pulled back to look at me, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "It's been my greatest honor to be your father, and it will be my greatest honor to walk you to the man who will love you the way you deserve to be loved." Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, and a look of efficient determination on her face. "It's time," she announced. "The guests are seated, the groom is in position, and the musicians are ready to begin." My heart started racing as the reality of the moment hit me. In a few minutes, I would be walking down the aisle toward Tyler, surrounded by everyone we loved most in the world. The months of planning, the stress over details, the excitement and anticipation had all led to this single moment. Indy handed me my bouquet and gave me one final hug. "Go get married, beautiful," she said with a grin. The ceremony itself passed like a dream. I remember the music starting, the doors opening, and suddenly I was walking down the aisle with my father, my eyes locked on Tyler's face as he watched me approach. He looked impossibly handsome in his black tuxedo, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his expression one of complete awe. When our eyes met, he mouthed, "Wow," and I felt my heart skip a beat. The efficient, A family friend who had known both Tyler and me for years, spoke about love and commitment and the journey we were beginning together. Tyler's vows brought tears to my eyes as he promised to support my dreams, to laugh with me through life's challenges, and to love me with the same intensity every day for the rest of our lives. When it was my turn to speak, I told him that he had made me believe in fairy tales, and that I couldn't wait to write the rest of our story together. The moment we were pronounced husband and wife felt like pure magic. Tyler's kiss was soft and sweet, filled with promise and joy, and the applause from our guests seemed to echo across the water. As we walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, I felt like I was floating on air. The cocktail hour was everything I had hoped it would be. Guests mingled on the terrace overlooking the lake, sipping signature cocktails and sampling appetizers, while a string quartet played softly in the background. Tyler and I moved through the crowd together, accepting congratulations and hugs from people who had traveled from near and far to celebrate with us. My father found us near the bar, where Tyler was ordering champagne for a toast with his groomsmen.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Dad pulled me aside for a private moment, his expression serious but warm. "I wanted to tell you something before we get to dinner," he said quietly. "Watching you today, seeing how happy you are, it reminds me why I work so hard to keep the world safe. It's for moments like this, for families like ours, for love like what you and Tyler have found." His words touched me deeply, and I squeezed his hand gratefully. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know." As the sun began to set, Mrs. Hartwell gathered everyone for the transition into the reception space. The ballroom had been transformed into something out of a magazine, with round tables draped in ivory linens and centerpieces that seemed to glow in the soft lighting. Our head table was positioned perfectly to overlook the dance floor, and our wedding cake, a 3-tier masterpiece covered in buttercream roses and delicate sugarwork, stood proudly on a dedicated table near the entrance. The cake had been one of my biggest splurges, designed by Austin's most sought-after baker to be both beautiful and delicious. The bottom layer was vanilla bean with raspberry filling, the middle tier was chocolate with salted caramel, and the top was lemon with lavender buttercream. It had taken 3 consultations to get the design exactly right, and the end result was more stunning than I had even imagined. Dinner was a celebration of everything Tyler and I loved, from the herb-crusted salmon that reminded us of our first vacation together, to the chocolate dessert that recreated the flavors from the restaurant where he had proposed. The speeches were heartfelt and funny, with Indy sharing embarrassing stories from law school and Tyler's best man recounting their adventures from medical residency. When it came time for the father-daughter dance, my dad led me onto the floor while the band played "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song he used to sing to me when I was little. As we swayed together under the twinkling lights, he whispered stories about my childhood and told me how proud he was of the woman I had become. "You know," he said as the song neared its end, "being your father has been the greatest privilege of my life. Whatever challenges come your way, remember that you're stronger than you know, and you're loved beyond measure." The evening continued with dancing and laughter, with guests of all ages filling the floor and celebrating with an energy that seemed to light up the entire room. Tyler and I stole quiet moments together between songs, marveling at how perfect everything felt and how seamlessly our families and friends had come together. As midnight approached, Mrs. Hartwell announced that it was time for the cake cutting, one of the final traditions before Tyler and I would make our exit in a shower of sparklers. The photographer positioned us behind the beautiful creation, with Tyler's hand covering mine on the silver knife that had been a wedding gift from my grandparents. "Make a wish," Tyler whispered in my ear as we prepared to make the first cut. I closed my eyes for a moment, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, and wished for a lifetime of moments just like this one. When I opened them, Tyler was smiling at me with so much love that I felt my heart might burst. We cut into the bottom layer together, and I fed Tyler a small bite while he did the same for me. The cake was even more delicious than I had remembered from our tasting, with the vanilla and raspberry flavors perfectly balanced, and the buttercream light and sweet. As the photographer captured our laughter and the guests applauded, I caught sight of Brooke standing near the back of the crowd. She was watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that looked almost like satisfaction mixed with nervousness. When our eyes met, she raised her champagne glass in a toast and smiled. But there was something hollow about it that sent a tiny chill down my spine. I pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to exhaustion and the emotional intensity of the day. This was my wedding, my perfect day, and nothing was going to diminish the joy I felt in that moment. The rest of the cake was distributed to our guests, while Tyler and I continued dancing, lost in our own world of happiness and love. The sparkler send-off was magical, with 200 people creating a tunnel of light as we ran toward the vintage car that would take us to our hotel suite. It wasn't until we were alone in the car, Tyler's hand in mine as we drove through the quiet Austin streets, that I began to feel the first signs that something was wrong. It started as a mild nausea, which I initially attributed to exhaustion and the rich dinner. But as we reached the hotel, the feeling intensified into something more concerning. "Are you okay?" Tyler asked as we entered our suite, noticing that I had gone pale. "I think I might have eaten too much," I said, trying to laugh it off. Or maybe I'm just overwhelmed by how perfect everything was. But even as I said the words, I knew something was seriously wrong. The nausea was becoming more intense, accompanied by a strange metallic taste in my mouth, and a growing sense of dizziness that made me grip Tyler's arm for support. "Zara," Tyler said, his voice taking on the tone he used when his medical training kicked in. "Talk to me, what exactly are you feeling?" Before I could answer, a wave of severe nausea hit me like a freight train, and I barely made it to the bathroom before I started vomiting with a violence that scared both of us. Tyler was beside me immediately, holding my hair back and checking my pulse with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years in emergency medicine. "This isn't normal," he said quietly, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "We need to get you to a hospital." The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, emergency room lights, and medical personnel, asking rapid-fire questions about what I had eaten and when the symptoms had started. Tyler never left my side, switching seamlessly between being my husband and being a doctor as he communicated with the medical team about my condition. As they ran tests and started IV fluids, I kept thinking about the cake, about that moment of pure happiness when Tyler and I had fed each other the first bites. It seemed impossible that something so beautiful, so symbolic of our love and commitment, could have been the source of whatever was making me so sick. But as the night wore on and my condition continued to deteriorate, the doctors began asking more specific questions about the food at our reception. They wanted to know who had access to the cake, who had served it, and whether anyone else was experiencing similar symptoms. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Patel, the attending physician, pulled Tyler aside for a conversation I could hear from my hospital bed, despite their attempts to speak quietly. "The preliminary blood work is concerning," she said. "We're seeing markers that suggest possible poisoning, which means we need to involve law enforcement immediately." The word poisoning hit me like a physical blow, stealing what little breath I had left. As Tyler returned to my bedside with tears in his eyes and Dr. Patel made the call that would bring my father and his team to the hospital, I realized that my perfect wedding day had become the beginning of the worst nightmare I could have ever imagined. Someone had deliberately tried to hurt me on what should have been the happiest day of my life, and as I lay there connected to machines and fighting for my health, I couldn't shake the image of Brooke's hollow smile as she watched me take that first bite of cake. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed overhead as my father paced outside my room, his phone pressed to his ear, and his voice carrying the authoritative tone that made federal agents snap to attention. Even through the haze of medication and exhaustion, I could hear fragments of his conversation with what I assumed was his team at the FBI field office. "I need a full forensic team at Lakeside Manor immediately," he was saying. "Treat this as a potential crime scene. Nobody touches anything until we've processed every surface, every plate, every utensil." Tyler sat beside my bed holding my hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across my knuckles as we both tried to process what was happening. The morning sun was streaming through the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor and highlighting the exhaustion etched into his features. He hadn't slept at all, choosing instead to monitor my vital signs and communicate with the medical team throughout the night. Dr. Patel returned with a tablet in her hands, and an expression that told me the news wasn't going to be good. She pulled up a chair beside my bed and spoke in the careful, measured tone that doctors use when delivering information that will change everything. "The toxicology results confirm our suspicions," she began. "You were poisoned with ricin, a highly toxic substance derived from castor beans. The amount found in your system suggests it was concentrated and deliberately administered." The word ricin hit me like a physical blow. Even through my legal training, I knew enough about federal crimes to understand the implications. Ricin wasn't something you accidentally encountered or casually obtained. It required specific knowledge, deliberate preparation, and access to materials that weren't readily available to the general public. "How much?" Tyler asked, his medical training taking over. "What kind of dosage are we looking at?" "Enough to cause serious harm, but fortunately, not enough to be fatal," Dr. Patel replied. "The symptoms you experienced, Zara, nausea, vomiting, difficulty breathing, elevated heart rate, are all consistent with ricin poisoning. You're going to recover fully, but it's going to take time." My father appeared in the doorway, his face grave and his FBI credentials already hanging from his neck. Behind him stood Agent Kim, a woman I had met at various bureau functions over the years. She was younger than my father, probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that made her exceptionally good at her job. "Sweetheart," Dad said, approaching my bed carefully. "I know this is difficult, but Agent Kim needs to ask you some questions while the details are still fresh in your memory." Agent Kim pulled out a digital recorder and set it on the bedside table. "Zara, I'm going to record this conversation for the investigation. Everything you tell me could be crucial in identifying who did this to you." I nodded weakly, my throat still raw from the night's ordeal. Tyler squeezed my hand encouragingly as Agent Kim began her questioning. "Let's start with the cake," she said. "Walk me through everything you remember about the cake-cutting ceremony. Who was present? Who had access to the cake before you ate it?" I closed my eyes, trying to reconstruct the scene from just hours earlier. Mrs. Hartwell, our wedding planner, announced it was time for the cake cutting. Tyler and I went over to the table where it was displayed. The photographer positioned us behind it. Was anyone else involved in serving the cake? The catering staff cut and distributed pieces to the guests after Tyler and I had our ceremonial bite. I said slowly. But Tyler and I ate directly from the cake itself, not from a served piece. Agent Kim made notes on her tablet. Who had access to the cake before the ceremony? The question hung in the air as I tried to remember. The cake had been delivered that morning and set up in the reception space hours before guests arrived. Throughout the cocktail hour and dinner, it had been on display where dozens of people could have approached it. "The catering staff, obviously," I said. "Mrs. Hartwell, the photographer and her assistant. Anyone who walked through the reception space during cocktail hour. Family members?" My stomach clenched as I realized where this line of questioning was heading. "Yes. My parents, Brooke, Tyler's family, the wedding party. Anyone could have approached the table." Agent Kim's expression remained neutral, but I caught the meaningful look she exchanged with my father. They were already thinking what I didn't want to think, that this wasn't a random attack by a stranger, but something much more personal and devastating. "Tell me about your relationship with your sister," Agent Kim said gently. The question felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Brooke and I had always had a complicated relationship, marked by the natural competition that sometimes exists between siblings. She was athletic where I was academic, spontaneous where I was cautious, charming where I was reserved. But the idea that she could have deliberately poisoned me seemed impossible to comprehend. "We're sisters," I said weakly. "We've had our disagreements over the years, but nothing that would justify this." "What kind of disagreements?" Tyler's hand tightened around mine as I struggled to find words that wouldn't implicate my own sister in an attempted murder. But Agent Kim was waiting, and I knew that withholding information could compromise the investigation. "Career stuff, mostly," I admitted. "Brooke never went to college. She's worked various jobs, retail, restaurants, personal training. She's always felt like our parents favored me because of my education and career success. Has she ever expressed resentment about that?" I thought back to family dinners where Brooke would make cutting remarks about my fancy law degree or my perfect life. Comments that I had always dismissed as sibling rivalry but that now took on a much darker significance. Sometimes, I whispered. But I never thought she truly meant it. Agent Kim continued her questioning for another hour, covering everything from guest lists to seating arrangements to the timeline of events throughout the day. By the time she finished, I felt drained and emotionally raw, struggling to reconcile the sister I loved with the possibility that she had tried to kill me. After Agent Kim left, my father sat down heavily in the chair beside my bed. The authoritative FBI director had been replaced by a man who looked every one of his 62 years, his face etched with pain and confusion. "I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years," he said quietly. "I've investigated every kind of crime imaginable, but I never thought I'd be sitting in a hospital room trying to figure out which of my daughters tried to murder the other." The weight of his words settled over us like a suffocating blanket. Tyler excused himself to get coffee, understanding that my father and I needed this moment alone. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what if it really was Brooke?" He was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Austin skyline. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Then I'll make sure she faces the full consequences of her actions," he said. "Federal charges for ricin possession and attempted murder. Life in prison if she's convicted." The clinical nature of his words contrasted sharply with the pain in his eyes. This was my father, the FBI director, speaking, but underneath was a man whose family was being torn apart by unthinkable circumstances. "How do we even begin to process this?" I asked. "We focus on getting you healthy," he replied, "and we let the investigation follow the evidence wherever it leads." Over the next few days, as I slowly recovered in the hospital, the investigation began to reveal details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The forensic team had found traces of ricin on the cake server that had been used during the ceremony, confirming that the poison had been applied to the cake itself rather than introduced through the catering process. Security cameras from the venue showed various people approaching the cake table throughout the evening, but the angle and lighting made it difficult to see exactly what each person was doing. However, one piece of footage was particularly troubling: a clear shot of Brooke standing beside the cake table for several minutes during the cocktail hour, her body positioned in a way that blocked the view of what she was doing with her hands. Tyler had been staying at the hospital around the clock, sleeping in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, and managing communication with our families and friends. The story had somehow leaked to the local media, and reporters were camped outside the hospital, hoping for statements from my father or updates on my condition. "The whole city is talking about it," Tyler said as he scrolled through news articles on his phone. "FBI director's daughter poisoned at wedding. Sister suspected in federal investigation. It's becoming a media circus." I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the ricin. Our private family tragedy was becoming public entertainment, dissected and analyzed by strangers who had no understanding of the pain and confusion we were experiencing. On my third day in the hospital, Indy arrived with flowers and a care package filled with my favorite snacks and magazines. She had been fielding calls from concerned friends and colleagues, trying to manage the external chaos while we dealt with the internal crisis. "People are asking a lot of questions," she said carefully. "About Brooke, about your family, about what might have motivated something like this. What are you telling them?" "That it's an ongoing investigation and that our focus is on your recovery," she replied. "But Zara, there's something you need to know. Some of our mutual friends are saying they weren't entirely surprised." I felt my blood run cold. "What do you mean?" Indy sat down in the chair beside my bed, her expression troubled. "Remember Emily from law school? She was at the wedding. She said Brooke made some comments during the reception that seemed odd at the time but are making more sense now." "What kind of comments?" "Something about how you always got everything you wanted, and how it was time for you to understand what it felt like to have something taken away." The words hit me like a physical blow. Even if Brooke had made such comments, I couldn't understand how that translated into attempted murder. The gap between resentment and actually trying to kill someone seemed impossibly vast. "There's more," Indy continued reluctantly. "Paige Winters, that friend of Brooke's who was at the wedding, she's been posting on social media about how the investigation is focusing on the wrong person. She's claiming Brooke would never hurt you, and that the FBI is looking for a scapegoat. The idea that this nightmare was playing out on social media made me feel sick all over again. Our family's private pain was becoming a public spectacle, with people taking sides and offering opinions about things they couldn't possibly understand. That afternoon, Agent Kim returned with an update that changed everything. She sat down with my father Tyler and me in my hospital room, her expression grim. "We've made significant progress in the investigation," she began. "We found Brooke's search history on her laptop, multiple queries about ricin production, symptoms of ricin poisoning, and how to extract toxins from castor beans." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was premeditated, carefully planned, and deliberately executed. "The searches date back 3 months, Agent Kim continued. "Right around the time you sent out wedding invitations. I felt like I was drowning. 3 months of planning meant this wasn't about a single argument or moment of jealousy. Brooke had been thinking about hurting me for months, researching methods, preparing for the opportunity. There's more," Agent Kim said. "We also found evidence that she purchased castor beans online 6 weeks ago. The vendor confirmed the sale and provided shipping records." My father's face had gone ashen. "Are you ready to make an arrest?" "We're executing a search warrant at her apartment this afternoon," Agent Kim replied. "If we find the materials we expect to find, we'll have enough for federal charges." The next few hours felt like an eternity. Tyler and I sat in my hospital room watching news coverage of FBI agents executing a search warrant at Brooke's apartment complex. The footage showed agents carrying out boxes of evidence, computer equipment, and what appeared to be laboratory materials. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from family members, friends, and reporters, but I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. How do you explain to people that your own sister tried to kill you? How do you process the fact that someone you shared a childhood with, someone you trusted completely, had spent months planning your murder? That evening, Agent Kim returned with news that sealed Brooke's fate. The search of her apartment had uncovered a makeshift laboratory in her bedroom closet, complete with castor beans, extraction equipment, and a small vial of what appeared to be refined ricin. She also kept a journal, Agent Kim said quietly, detailed entries about her planning process, her motivation, and her intended outcome. "What did she write?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Agent Kim consulted her notes. "The entries express significant resentment about your educational and career success. She wrote about feeling invisible compared to you, about believing your parents loved you more, about wanting to destroy what she called your perfect life." The words felt surreal, like something from a crime drama, rather than my actual life. How had I missed the depth of Brooke's pain and resentment? How had I failed to see that my own sister viewed me as an enemy rather than a family member? "The final entry was written the morning of your wedding," Agent Kim continued. "She wrote about feeling excited to finally level the playing field, and about how you would finally understand what it felt like to have everything taken away." My father stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders shaking with emotion. In all my years, I had never seen him cry, but I could tell he was fighting back tears as the full scope of Brooke's betrayal became clear. "When will you arrest her?" Tyler asked. "Tonight," Agent Kim replied. "Federal marshals are en route to her location now." As if on cue, my father's phone rang. He answered it with a clipped Castellanos and listened for several minutes before hanging up. "They have her," he said simply. The words should have brought relief, but instead I felt only a profound sadness that seemed to settle into my bones. Justice was being served, but at the cost of losing my sister forever. The family that had gathered to celebrate my wedding just days earlier was now fractured beyond repair. Over the next week, as I recovered enough to be discharged from the hospital, the full legal machinery of the federal justice system began to grind into motion. Brooke was charged with possession of a biological weapon, attempted murder, and domestic terrorism. The charges carried a potential sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The media coverage was relentless and invasive. Our family photos were splashed across front pages and television screens, with commentators analyzing our relationships and speculating about our dynamics. The perfect wedding that was supposed to mark the beginning of my new life with Tyler had become the catalyst for the destruction of everything I thought I knew about my family. My mother struggled the most with the revelations about Brooke. She blamed herself for missing the signs, for not recognizing the depth of Brooke's resentment, for somehow failing as a parent. She spent hours on the phone with therapists and family counselors, trying to understand how one daughter could have harbored such hatred for another. "I keep thinking about all the times she seemed happy for you," Mom said during one of our difficult conversations. "When you graduated from law school, when you got engaged, when you were planning the wedding, was she pretending the entire time?" It was a question none of us could answer. The Brooke who had helped me choose my wedding dress and who had smiled during the ceremony seemed like a completely different person from the one who had spent months planning to poison me. The disconnect was so profound that it felt like we were talking about two different people. As the legal proceedings moved forward, more details emerged about Brooke's state of mind and her preparation for the crime. The prosecution painted a picture of someone consumed by jealousy and resentment, someone who had carefully planned and executed an attempt on my life with chilling precision. The defense argued that Brooke was suffering from mental illness and that her actions were the result of undiagnosed psychological conditions rather than calculated malice. They presented evidence of depression, anxiety, and feelings of inadequacy that had apparently been building for years. But regardless of the psychological factors involved, the evidence was overwhelming. Brooke had made a deliberate choice to try to kill me, and she had come terrifyingly close to succeeding. The fact that we shared DNA and childhood memories didn't change the reality of what she had done. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after my wedding day, and I dreaded the prospect of seeing Brooke in court. How do you look at someone who tried to murder you when that person is also your sister? How do you reconcile love and betrayal when they're embodied in the same person? As Tyler and I tried to piece our lives back together, we found ourselves questioning everything we thought we knew about family, trust, and safety. The wedding we had planned so carefully had become a crime scene. The sister I had loved and trusted had become a defendant in a federal courtroom. The future we had imagined together was now shadowed by trauma and uncertainty. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the signs had been there if we had known how to read them. Brooke's comments about my success, her absence from family celebrations, her subtle undermining of my achievements, all of it took on new meaning in retrospect. The sister who had tried to kill me hadn't suddenly snapped. She had been planning this for months, hiding her true feelings behind a mask of familial love and support. The investigation had revealed the depths of Brooke's deception, but it had also revealed the fragility of the bonds I had always taken for granted. Family, I was learning, was not the unbreakable foundation I had always believed it to be. Sometimes the people closest to you were the ones capable of causing the most devastating harm. The decision to confront Brooke face-to-face came to me during a sleepless night 3 weeks after my discharge from the hospital. Tyler found me sitting on our apartment balcony at 4 in the morning, wrapped in a blanket and staring at the city lights below. The Austin skyline looked peaceful in the pre-dawn darkness, but my mind was anything but calm. "I need to see her," I said without preamble as Tyler settled into the chair beside me. He didn't ask who I meant. We had been dancing around this conversation for days, both of us knowing that I wouldn't be able to move forward until I looked my sister in the eye and tried to understand what had driven her to such extremes. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Tyler asked gently. The prosecution team advised against any contact before the trial. "I don't care what they advised," I replied, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "I need to hear it from her. I need to understand why she threw away our entire family. For what? Jealousy? Resentment? There has to be more to it than what we're seeing in police reports and psychological evaluations." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, studying my profile in the dim light. "Okay," he said finally, "but I'm coming with you. And we're bringing Agent Kim." The Travis County Jail was a fortress of concrete and steel that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. As Tyler and I followed Agent Kim through the security checkpoints, I tried to prepare myself for seeing Brooke in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Nothing could have prepared me for the reality. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the institutional clothing or the sterile environment. Her auburn hair hung limp around her face, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping any better than I was. When she saw me through the reinforced glass of the visiting room, Her expression crumpled into something that looked like genuine remorse. We sat across from each other with the glass partition between us, speaking through phones that made our voices sound tinny and distant. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. We just stared at each other, two sisters who had once shared a bedroom and secrets and dreams, now separated by an attempted murder charge. "Zara," Brooke said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air between us, inadequate and hollow. Sorry didn't begin to cover the magnitude of what she had done, the lives she had destroyed, the trust she had shattered. "Why?" I asked, the single word carrying the weight of all my confusion and pain. Brooke closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "Because I was drowning," she said. "And I thought if I could pull you down with me, maybe I wouldn't feel so alone anymore." The honesty of her answer caught me off guard. I had expected excuses, justifications, anything but this raw admission of how deep her pain had run. Quote, "Drowning in what?" I pressed. "In being the daughter who never measured up," she replied. "In watching you succeed at everything while I failed at everything. In feeling like I was invisible in our own family." I wanted to argue with her, to tell her that she was wrong, that our parents loved her just as much as they loved me. But as I sat there looking at my sister's broken expression, I began to see our childhood through her eyes for the first time. "Do you remember when I dropped out of community college?" Brooke asked. I nodded. She had been studying business administration, but had quit after a semester and a half, claiming the coursework was boring and irrelevant. "Dad didn't speak to me for 2 weeks," she continued. "But when you got into law school, he threw a party. When I got fired from the restaurant for missing too many shifts, Mom lectured me about responsibility. When you made partner at the firm, she sent out Christmas cards bragging about your success." Each example felt like a small knife twist, not because Brooke was wrong, but because she was right. Our parents had celebrated my achievements while treating her failures as disappointments to be managed, rather than struggles to be supported. "I tried to be happy for you," Brooke said, her voice growing stronger. "I really did. When you got engaged, I was genuinely excited. Tyler seemed perfect for you. And I wanted you to have the fairy tale wedding you'd been dreaming about since we were kids." Then what changed? Brooke was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands folded in her lap. When she looked up again, her expression had hardened into something that reminded me of the old Brooke, the one who could cut you down with a single sharp comment. "The engagement party," she said. "Do you remember Dad's toast that night?" I did remember. Dad had raised his glass and spoken eloquently about my accomplishments, my character, my bright future with Tyler. It had been one of those perfect family moments that I had treasured. "He talked about you for 10 minutes, Brooke continued. "Your law degree, your career, your perfect relationship, your bright future. He called you his pride and joy. And then he looked at me and said, 'And of course we're proud of Brooke too.'" The memory hit me like a physical blow. I remembered the toast differently, through the lens of being the honored guest. But seeing it through Brooke's eyes, I could understand how those few perfunctory words would have felt like the final confirmation that she was an afterthought in our father's affections. "That's when I started researching," she admitted. "At first I was just curious about poisons, about how someone could hurt someone else without anyone knowing. It was like a dark fantasy, imagining what it would be like to watch you suffer the way I had been suffering." The clinical way she described her planning process was more chilling than any outburst of emotion would have been. This hadn't been a crime of passion. It had been a slow-burning revenge fantasy that had eventually consumed her completely. "The ricin was almost too easy to make," Brooke continued. "I ordered the castor beans online, followed instructions I found on the dark web. It took me 3 tries to get a concentration that would cause serious harm without being immediately fatal." "Why not fatal?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Because I didn't want to kill you," she said simply. "I wanted to ruin your perfect day. I wanted you to know what it felt like to have something precious taken away from you. I wanted everyone to see that your charmed life wasn't as untouchable as it seemed." The twisted logic of her reasoning was almost more disturbing than if she had simply wanted me dead. She had calculated the dosage carefully, planning to cause me significant suffering while ensuring that I would survive to live with the trauma. I thought if you got sick at your wedding, if the perfect day you'd been planning for months was destroyed, maybe you'd finally understand what it felt like to be me, Brooke said. Maybe you'd know what it was like to have something you cared about taken away. Agent Kim, who had been silent throughout our conversation, leaned forward slightly. Brooke, you understand that regardless of your motivations, you committed a federal crime? You could spend the rest of your life in prison. Brooke nodded slowly. I know. And I deserve it. What I did was unforgivable. But even as she said the words, I could see that part of her still believed her actions were justified. The resentment that had driven her to poison me hadn't disappeared just because she was facing consequences. If anything, the attention focused on her crime seemed to validate her belief that she had been overlooked and undervalued. Do you want me to forgive you? I asked. The question seemed to surprise her. She studied my face through the glass, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give her. I want you to understand that I never meant for it to go this far, she said finally. I just wanted you to hurt the way I was hurting. But you did mean for it to go this far, I replied. You researched for months. You bought materials. You practiced making the poison. You planned exactly when and how to administer it. Every step was a choice you made. Brooke's composure cracked again, and she pressed her hand against the glass between us. Zara, please. You're my sister. We grew up together. Doesn't that count for something? Looking at her desperate expression, I felt a complex mix of emotions that I couldn't begin to untangle. Love, anger, pity, betrayal, grief for the relationship we would never have again. She was my sister, but she was also someone who had tried to poison me on my wedding day. It counts for something, I said carefully. But it doesn't excuse what you did. And it doesn't mean I can just forgive you and pretend this never happened. The rest of our conversation was stilted and painful, filled with long silences and attempts to find common ground that no longer existed. By the time Agent Kim indicated that our time was up, I felt emotionally drained but oddly relieved. Seeing Brooke hadn't provided the closure I had hoped for, but it had given me something equally valuable: clarity. As Tyler and I drove home from the jail, I found myself thinking about forgiveness and justice, about family loyalty and personal responsibility. The conversation with Brooke had humanized her without excusing her actions. She was still my sister, but she was also someone who had made a deliberate choice to cause me serious harm. How do you feel? Tyler asked as we sat in traffic on I-35. Sad, I said honestly. Sad for her, sad for our family, sad for everything we've lost, but also angry that she's still trying to justify what she did. Do you think she's genuinely remorseful? I considered the question carefully. I think she's sorry she got caught. I think she's sorry about the consequences. But I'm not sure she's sorry about the actual crime. That evening, I called my parents to tell them about the jail visit. My mother cried when I described Brooke's appearance and demeanor, still clinging to the hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could be resolved with enough love and understanding. She's still our daughter, Mom said through her tears. Whatever she's done, she's still our baby girl. My father's response was more complicated. As an FBI director, he understood the severity of Brooke's crimes and the necessity of holding her accountable. But as a father, he was struggling with the knowledge that one of his daughters had tried to murder the other. I've been thinking about what I missed, he said during our conversation. The signs I should have seen, the conversations we should have had. But I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Brooke made her own choices. We all have disappointments and resentments. Most people don't respond by trying to poison their siblings. His words were harsh but accurate. Whatever psychological factors had contributed to Brooke's actions, she had ultimately chosen to commit a serious crime. The responsibility for that choice belonged to her alone. Over the following weeks, as the prosecution prepared their case for trial, more details emerged about Brooke's preparation and planning. Her internet search history revealed months of research, not just into ricin production, but into my schedule, my habits, and the wedding planning process. She had studied my life with the dedication of a stalker, looking for the perfect opportunity to strike. The prosecution team discovered that Brooke had actually attended a wedding planning meeting with me and Mrs. Hartwell 6 weeks before my wedding, using the opportunity to gather detailed information about the cake, the timeline, and the layout of the venue. What I had interpreted as sisterly support had actually been reconnaissance for her planned attack. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of a backup plan. If the cake poisoning had failed or been discovered too early, Brooke had prepared ricin-laced champagne that she intended to give me as a special toast from the family. The level of premeditation was staggering, suggesting someone who was completely committed to causing me harm regardless of the risks or consequences. The media coverage of these revelations was intense and invasive. Our family became the subject of true crime podcasts, television specials, and endless social media speculation. The narrative that emerged painted me as the golden child whose success had driven her sister to attempted murder, while Brooke was portrayed as either a victim of family dynamics or a calculating would-be killer, depending on the source. I stopped reading the coverage after a particularly vicious blog post suggested that I had somehow brought the attack on myself by being too successful and making my sister feel inadequate. The victim blaming was breathtaking in its audacity, but it also reflected a broader discomfort with the idea that family members could be capable of such violence against each other. As the trial date approached, I found myself dreading the prospect of testifying against my own sister. The prosecution had warned me that the defense would likely try to paint Brooke as mentally ill and not fully responsible for her actions. They would explore our family dynamics, my parents, treatment of both daughters, and the psychological pressures that had contributed to Brooke's breakdown. I understood the legal strategy, but the thought of having our family's private pain dissected in open court was almost unbearable. The wedding that was supposed to be a celebration of love and new beginnings had become the centerpiece of a criminal trial that would be covered by national media. Tyler and I began working with a therapist to process the trauma of the poisoning and prepare for the emotional challenges of the trial. Dr. Martinez was a specialist in family violence, who helped us understand that Brooke's actions were part of a pattern of thinking that had developed over years, not a sudden break from reality. Sibling violence is more common than people realize, she explained during one of our sessions. But it's often minimized or dismissed as normal family conflict. What makes your case unusual is the premeditation and the severity of the attack. Do you think she'll be convicted? I asked. Based on what you've told me about the evidence, it seems likely, Dr. Martinez replied. But you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that she'll receive a lighter sentence if the jury believes she was mentally ill at the time of the crime. The thought of Brooke receiving anything less than the maximum sentence felt like a betrayal of justice, but I was beginning to understand that the legal system didn't always align with personal feelings about right and wrong. The trial would be about facts and evidence and legal standards, not about my need for vindication or closure. As I prepared to testify, I found myself thinking about the sister I had grown up with, the one who had helped me build blanket forts and shared midnight snacks, and defended me against playground bullies. That sister felt like a completely different person from the one who had spent months planning to poison me, yet they were the same person. The contradiction was almost impossible to reconcile. The night before the trial was set to begin, I couldn't sleep. I stood on our apartment balcony again, looking out at the city lights and thinking about how much had changed since my wedding day. The naive optimism I had felt as a new bride seemed like it belonged to a different lifetime, replaced by a hard-earned understanding of how fragile safety and trust could be. Tyler found me there just as he had weeks earlier, but this time he didn't try to comfort me with words. He simply stood beside me, his presence a reminder that not everyone in my life was capable of betrayal. Some bonds, I was learning, were strong enough to survive even the worst kinds of trauma. Tomorrow we get justice, he said quietly. Tomorrow we try to get justice, I corrected. There's a difference. As dawn broke over Austin, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt something shifting inside me. The victim who had awakened in a hospital bed 3 months earlier was still part of me, but she was no longer the dominant part. I was ready to face my sister in court, to tell my story, and to fight for the justice that had been so violently disrupted on what should have been the happiest day of my life. The trial would determine Brooke's legal fate, but I was beginning to understand that my own healing didn't depend on the verdict. It depended on my willingness to speak the truth, to hold her accountable, and to refuse to let her actions define the rest of my life. The sister who had tried to poison me had taken away my perfect wedding day, but she wouldn't take away my future. Standing there watching the sunrise, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the night of the poisoning. Hope. Not for reconciliation with Brooke, that ship had sailed. But hope for justice, for healing, and for the possibility that truth and accountability could coexist with love and forgiveness, in ways I was only beginning to understand. The federal courthouse in downtown Austin buzzed with an energy that felt electric and dangerous as I walked through the marble corridors toward courtroom 6A. News vans lined the street outside, and reporters jostled for position behind the security barriers, their cameras and microphones creating a gauntlet I had to navigate just to enter the building. Tyler's hand was steady in mine as we passed through the metal detectors, his presence anchoring me as everything else seemed to spiral beyond my control. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Moreno had prepared me extensively for this moment, but nothing could have readied me for the reality of seeing Brooke seated at the defendant's table in a navy blue suit that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had in the orange jumpsuit. Her defense attorney, Marcus Webb, was a high-profile criminal lawyer known for his ability to humanize even the most unsympathetic defendants. My father had warned me that Webb would try to turn Brooke into a victim of family dysfunction, rather than the perpetrator of a calculated crime. Judge Patricia Hoffman called the court to order with a sharp rap of her gavel, and the weight of federal authority settled over the packed courtroom like a heavy blanket. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, flanked by Tyler and my parents, all of us wearing the kind of somber clothing appropriate for what felt like both a trial and a funeral. Ada Moreno's opening statement was crisp and devastating, laying out the timeline of Brooke's planning with methodical precision. She showed the jury screenshots of internet searches, receipts for castor bean purchases, and photographs of the makeshift laboratory found in Brooke's apartment. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of someone who had spent months preparing to commit a serious federal crime. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Moreno said, pacing in front of the jury box with controlled intensity. "This was not a crime of passion. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a carefully orchestrated attempt to poison Zara Castellanos on her wedding day, using one of the most deadly biological agents known to law enforcement." She clicked a remote, and crime scene photos appeared on the courtroom's large monitor. The images of the cake table, the silver serving knife, and the laboratory equipment were stark and clinical, stripping away any romanticism about sibling rivalry or family dysfunction. The defendant researched ricin production for 3 months. She purchased the raw materials 6 weeks before the wedding. She practiced extraction techniques until she achieved the concentration she wanted. She attended wedding planning meetings to gather intelligence about the venue and timeline. And on August 15th, she executed her plan with the cold precision of a trained assassin. When it was Webb's turn to address the jury, his tone was entirely different. He spoke softly, almost conversationally, about mental illness and family trauma, about a young woman who had been overlooked and undervalued until her pain became unbearable. "Brooke Castellanos is sick," he said simply. "She suffers from severe depression, anxiety, and what we now understand to be a profound psychological break that distorted her thinking and her judgment. This is not a case about premeditated murder. This is a case about untreated mental illness, manifesting in tragic and destructive ways." Webb showed the jury childhood photos of Brooke and me together, smiling at birthday parties and family vacations, looking like any normal siblings. He spoke about the pressure of growing up as the daughter of an FBI director, about the impossible standards set by having a successful sister, about years of feeling invisible and inadequate. "My client's actions were inexcusable," Webb continued, "but they were also the actions of someone who was not in control of her mental faculties. The law recognizes that people suffering from severe mental illness cannot be held to the same standards of criminal responsibility as those who are mentally healthy." I felt a surge of anger at the defense strategy, not because it was unfair or illegal, but because it felt like another attempt to diminish my experience and minimize the severity of what Brooke had done to me. Mental illness might explain her actions, but it didn't excuse them or erase the trauma she had caused. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days, with the methodical thoroughness that characterized federal investigations. Agent Kim testified about the forensic evidence, walking the jury through the timeline of discovery and the painstaking process of tracing the ricin back to Brooks' apartment. FBI forensics experts explained how they had identified the poison on the cake server and matched it to the materials found in Brooks' makeshift laboratory. Dr. Sarah Chen, the toxicologist who had analyzed my blood samples, provided chilling testimony about the effects of ricin poisoning and how close I had come to permanent organ damage or death. Her clinical description of what the poison would have done to my body if I had consumed more of it left several jurors looking visibly shaken. Ricin attacks the body's cellular structure, Dr. Chen explained to the jury. Even in non-fatal doses, it can cause lasting damage to the kidneys, liver, and respiratory system. Ms. Castellanos was fortunate that she consumed a relatively small amount and received immediate medical attention. The prosecution also called Mrs. Hartwell, our wedding planner, who testified about Brooks' attendance at planning meetings and her unusual interest in details about the cake and reception timeline. Under cross-examination, Webb tried to paint Brooks' involvement as normal sisterly support, but Mrs. Hartwell's precise recollection of Brooks' specific questions about cake placement and serving procedures undermined that narrative. She asked very detailed questions about when the cake would be cut, how long it would be displayed beforehand, and who would have access to the reception area during cocktail hour. Mrs. Hartwell testified, "At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, but the questions were more specific than what most family members typically ask." On the third day of testimony, Ada Moreno called me to the witness stand. The walk from my seat to the front of the courtroom felt like the longest journey of my life, with every eye in the packed gallery following my movement. As I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I caught sight of Brooke watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Moreno's direct examination was straightforward and compassionate, allowing me to tell my story in my own words without unnecessary drama or sensationalism. I described the wedding day, the joy I had felt, the perfect details that had taken months to plan. I walked the jury through the cake-cutting ceremony, the first symptoms of illness, and the terrifying hours in the hospital when doctors struggled to identify what was wrong with me. "Can you describe for the jury what it felt like to realize that someone had poisoned you?" Moreno asked. I took a deep breath, looking directly at the jurors as I answered. It felt like my entire reality had been shattered. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and instead it became the most terrifying. But worse than the physical symptoms was the knowledge that someone had deliberately tried to hurt me, someone who knew me well enough to access the cake and choose the perfect moment to strike. And when you learned that your sister was responsible, the question hung in the air for a moment as I struggled to find words that could adequately convey the complexity of that betrayal. "It felt like losing two people at once," I said finally, "the sister I thought I knew, and the person I thought I was. If Brooke could hate me enough to try to kill me, then everything I believed about our relationship, about our family, was a lie." Webb's cross-examination was more aggressive than I had expected, though he maintained a respectful tone throughout. He focused heavily on our childhood and family dynamics, trying to establish a pattern of favoritism and inequality that might have contributed to Brooke's psychological state. "Ms. Castellanos, would you agree that your parents had different expectations for you and your sister?" "All parents have different relationships with their children," I replied carefully. "But they loved us both." "But they celebrated your achievements more publicly than your sister's, didn't they?" I felt my jaw tighten. My achievements were more public in nature. I graduated from law school, became a partner at a law firm. Those are the kinds of accomplishments that parents typically celebrate publicly. And what about Brooke's accomplishments? Did your parents celebrate those with equal enthusiasm? The question was designed to make me acknowledge that Brooke had been treated differently. And while it wasn't entirely unfair, it felt like victim blaming wrapped in legal strategy. "Brooke's path was different from mine," I said, "but her parents supported her in her choices." Webb spent considerable time on the jail visit I had made to see Brooke, trying to use my own words to establish her mental state and diminished capacity. He played excerpts from the recorded conversation, highlighting Brooke's expressions of remorse and her descriptions of feeling overwhelmed and invisible. "During that conversation, did your sister appear to understand the full scope of what she had done?" I considered the question carefully. She understood that she had committed a crime and that she would face consequences. But I'm not sure she fully grasped the impact her actions had on our entire family. Did she seem mentally stable to you during that visit? She seemed sad and remorseful, but also still somewhat focused on justifying her actions based on perceived slights from our childhood. The defense case began the following Monday with a parade of mental health experts who painted Brooke as someone suffering from severe psychological disorders that had gone undiagnosed and untreated for years. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychiatrist, testified that Brooke met the criteria for major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and what she termed adjustment disorder with disturbance of conduct. Ms. Castellanos was experiencing what we call a prolonged psychological crisis. Dr. Williams explained to the jury. Her thinking became increasingly distorted as she focused obsessively on perceived inequities in her family relationships. In her mind, the wedding represented the ultimate symbol of everything she felt she had been denied. The defense also called character witnesses who testified about Brooke's struggles with employment, relationships, and self-esteem. Former co-workers described someone who seemed increasingly isolated and bitter, while family friends spoke about watching her withdraw from social situations and family gatherings. Perhaps most damaging to the prosecution's case was the testimony of Dr. James Morrison, a nationally recognized expert on familial violence and psychological disorders. He argued that Brooke's actions were consistent with someone experiencing a severe dissociative episode brought on by untreated mental illness and accumulated psychological trauma. In cases like this, we often see individuals who feel so powerless and invisible that they resort to extreme actions as a way of asserting control and gaining recognition. Dr. Morrison testified. The defendant wasn't trying to kill her sister. She was trying to be seen and acknowledged, even if it meant causing harm. The prosecution's rebuttal was swift and effective. Ada Moreno called Dr. Elizabeth Foster, the FBI's chief forensic psychologist, who had extensively interviewed Brooke and reviewed all the evidence in the case. Mental illness may explain behavior, but it doesn't excuse criminal responsibility, Dr. Foster testified. Ms. Castellanos demonstrated clear planning ability, awareness of consequences, and the capacity to distinguish right from wrong. Her actions were deliberate and calculated, not the result of a psychotic break or diminished capacity. Dr. Foster's testimony was particularly effective because she acknowledged Brooke's mental health issues, while refusing to accept them as a complete defense for her criminal actions. Many people suffer from depression and anxiety without resorting to attempted murder, she said bluntly. Quote, "Mental illness alone does not explain or justify this level of premeditated violence." The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Webb called Brooke herself to testify in her own defense. She took the stand wearing the same navy suit from the opening day, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look even younger and more vulnerable. Under Webb's gentle questioning, Brooke spoke about her childhood feelings of inadequacy, her struggles with depression, and her growing resentment toward me and our parents. She described the months leading up to the wedding as a period of increasing desperation and distorted thinking. "I wasn't trying to kill Zara," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted her to understand what it felt like to have something precious taken away. I wanted her to know what it was like to be me. And do you understand now that what you did was wrong?" "Yes," Brooke replied, tears streaming down her face. "I understand that I hurt people I love. I understand that I destroyed our family. I would do anything to take it back." But Moreno's cross-examination revealed the limitations of Brooke's remorse and the calculated nature of her planning. Under aggressive questioning, Brooke admitted to researching ricin for months, to deliberately attending wedding planning meetings to gather information, and to preparing backup poisoning methods in case her primary plan failed. "You testified that you just wanted your sister to understand what it felt like to have something taken away," Moreno said. "But you also prepared ricin-laced champagne as a backup plan, didn't you?" "Yes," Brooke admitted quietly. "So if the cake poisoning had failed, you were prepared to try again?" "I wasn't thinking clearly." "But you were thinking clearly enough to research multiple poisoning methods, weren't you? You were thinking clearly enough to order materials online and set up a laboratory in your apartment." Brooke's composure began to crack under the relentless questioning. I was sick. I wasn't myself. You were sick enough to spend 3 months planning this attack? You were sick enough to calculate dosages that would cause serious harm without immediate death? By the time Moreno finished her cross-examination, Brooke's testimony had backfired spectacularly. Instead of a mentally ill woman acting without understanding, the jury had seen someone who was clearly capable of sophisticated planning and who understood the consequences of her actions. Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with both sides making their final appeals to a jury that had heard 2 weeks of devastating testimony. Webb made an emotional plea for mercy, arguing that Brooke was more victim than perpetrator, someone whose untreated mental illness had led her to make tragic choices. Brooke Castellanos is not a criminal mastermind, Webb argued. She's a deeply troubled young woman whose pain and illness clouded her judgment to the point where she couldn't see any other way to make her voice heard. Sending her to prison for the rest of her life won't undo the harm she caused, but it will destroy any chance she has of getting the treatment she needs and becoming a productive member of society. Moreno's closing argument was equally powerful, but focused on accountability and justice rather than sympathy. She reminded the jury that mental illness, however real and tragic, could not excuse attempted murder or the use of biological weapons. The defendant wants you to believe that she was too mentally ill to be held responsible for her actions, Moreno said. But the evidence shows someone who was perfectly capable of planning, preparing, and executing a sophisticated attack using one of the most dangerous substances known to law enforcement. Mental illness may explain her motivation, but it doesn't excuse her crimes. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation that was almost overwhelming. After 2 weeks of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments, the question of Brooke's guilt or innocence was in the hands of 12 strangers who would determine whether justice would be served. The wait for a verdict stretched over the weekend and into the following week, with the jury deliberating for nearly 18 hours before reaching their decision. During that time, I found myself obsessively checking news coverage and social media, trying to gauge public opinion about the case and predict which way the jury might lean. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, Tyler and I rushed back to the courthouse, along with what seemed like half of Austin. The media presence had intensified during deliberations, with national news outlets covering the case as a symbol of family dysfunction in the social media age. Judge Hoffman called the court to order, and the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict that would determine Brooke's fate and, in many ways, the course of our family's future. As I sat there waiting to hear whether my sister would spend the rest of her life in federal prison, I realized that no verdict could truly restore what had been lost or heal what had been broken. But it could provide accountability, and in a world where so much seemed beyond our control, that accountability felt like the closest thing to justice we were likely to find. The jury foreman's voice cut through the tension in the courtroom like a blade through silk. On the charge of possession of a biological weapon with intent to cause harm, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of domestic terrorism, we find the defendant guilty. Each word landed with the finality of a gavel strike, and I felt Tyler's hand tighten around mine as the reality of the verdict settled over the packed courtroom. Brooke remained motionless at the defendant's table, her face a mask of resignation that suggested she had been preparing for this outcome, despite her lawyer's optimistic predictions. Judge Hoffman scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving the defense time to prepare mitigation arguments and the prosecution time to compile victim impact statements. As court officers led Brooke away in handcuffs, she turned to look at me one final time. The expression on her face was complex, a mixture of regret, defiance, and something that might have been relief that the charade was finally over. The media frenzy outside the courthouse was overwhelming, with reporters shouting questions about my feelings regarding the verdict and my plans for the future. My father's security detail created a protective barrier as we made our way to the parking garage, but I could still hear fragments of the questions being hurled in our direction. Zara, do you feel justice has been served? Will you ever be able to forgive your sister? How has this changed your relationship with your family? I had no answers that would satisfy their hunger for dramatic sound bites. The truth was that the verdict felt both necessary and hollow, a legal conclusion that provided accountability, without healing the deeper wounds that Brooke's actions had created. Tyler and I spent the evening at my parents' house in Westlake Hills, sitting around the kitchen table that had been the site of countless family meals and conversations over the years. The atmosphere was subdued, marked by the kind of exhausted silence that follows the end of a long and painful ordeal. "I keep thinking about when she was little," my mother said quietly, staring into her untouched cup of tea. "She used to follow you everywhere, Zara. She wanted to do everything you did, wear what you wore, play the games you played. I never imagined that admiration could turn into something so destructive." My father, who had maintained his professional composure throughout the trial, looked older than his 62 years. The weight of having to investigate and prosecute his own daughter had taken a visible toll, adding lines to his face and silver to his hair that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. 28 years in law enforcement, he said, and I never imagined I'd be sitting here talking about one of my daughters trying to murder the other. I've seen every kind of family violence imaginable, but somehow I thought we were immune. The conversation that followed was difficult and necessary, touching on questions of guilt, responsibility, and the possibility of healing. We talked about the signs we might have missed, the conversations we should have had, and the family dynamics that had contributed to Brooke's psychological breakdown. But we also talked about the future, about how we would move forward as a family that had been fundamentally altered by betrayal and violence. The easy assumption that blood relationships guaranteed loyalty and love had been shattered, replaced by a more complex understanding of how family bonds could become twisted into something dangerous. Over the following weeks, as I prepared my victim impact statement for Brooke's sentencing hearing, I found myself reflecting on the nature of forgiveness and justice in ways I had never considered before. The legal system had provided a verdict, but the emotional and psychological work of healing was just beginning. I wrote multiple drafts of my statement, struggling to find words that captured the full scope of what Brooke's actions had cost me. It wasn't just the physical trauma of the poisoning, or the fear that someone had tried to kill me. It was the loss of innocence, the destruction of trust, and the knowledge that the sister I had loved and protected had spent months planning my suffering. But I also wrote about resilience, about the capacity to survive betrayal and emerge stronger, about the difference between justice and revenge. I had no interest in seeing Brooke suffer simply for the sake of suffering. I wanted accountability, consequences that would prevent her from harming anyone else, and the protection that comes from knowing that dangerous people are removed from society. The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 2 months after my wedding day. The courthouse was less crowded than it had been during the trial, but the media presence remained significant enough to require security escorts and careful coordination with my father's protection detail. Brooke looked different when she was brought into the courtroom for sentencing. 2 months in federal custody had changed her appearance in subtle but noticeable ways. She was thinner, paler, and carried herself with the institutional posture of someone who had learned to navigate the harsh realities of prison life. Her defense team presented an extensive mitigation package, including letters from mental health professionals, childhood friends, and even some family members who argued for leniency based on her psychological condition and lack of prior criminal history. They painted a picture of someone whose crime was an aberration rather than a reflection of her true character. Webb's sentencing argument was passionate and well-crafted, focusing on Brooke's mental health needs and the possibility of rehabilitation through intensive therapy and medication management. "Your Honor, my client is not a career criminal or a hardened terrorist," Webb argued. "She is a young woman whose untreated mental illness led her to make a terrible decision that she will regret for the rest of her life. Sending her to prison for decades will serve no purpose other than revenge." The prosecution's position was equally clear. Ada Moreno argued that the severity of Brooke's crimes, the level of premeditation involved, and the danger she posed to society required a substantial sentence that would both punish her actions and deter others who might consider similar crimes. This defendant spent months planning to poison her own sister with one of the most deadly biological agents known to law enforcement, Moreno told the court. She researched, planned, and executed a sophisticated attack that could have easily resulted in death. The only reason we're not here for a murder trial is luck and quick medical intervention. When it came time for me to deliver my victim impact statement, I walked to the podium with a mixture of determination and trepidation. I had practiced the words countless times, but speaking them in front of Brooke and a room full of strangers felt surreal and emotionally charged. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "On August 15th, I was supposed to be celebrating the beginning of my new life with my husband. Instead, I ended up fighting for my life in a hospital bed, betrayed by someone I trusted completely." I spoke about the physical trauma of the poisoning, the weeks of recovery, and the ongoing medical monitoring required to ensure that the ricin hadn't caused lasting organ damage. But I spent more time talking about the psychological impact, the way Brooke's betrayal had fundamentally altered my understanding of safety, trust, and family. "The person who tried to kill me wasn't a stranger or an enemy," I continued. "It was my sister, someone who had access to my life, my schedule, my wedding plans, someone who smiled at me while secretly planning my suffering. The violation of that trust has been more difficult to heal from than the physical effects of the poison." I looked directly at Brooke as I spoke, watching her face for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. What I saw was a mixture of sadness and something that still looked like self-pity, as if she remained more focused on her own suffering than on the harm she had caused. "I don't speak today seeking revenge," I said, turning back to Judge Hoffman. "But I do seek justice. Brooke's actions weren't the result of a momentary lapse in judgment or a sudden psychological break. They were the product of months of planning and preparation. She researched how to hurt me, she bought the materials to hurt me, and she executed a plan designed to cause me serious harm on the most important day of my life." I concluded by asking the court to impose a sentence that would reflect the severity of Brooke's crimes, while ensuring that she couldn't harm anyone else in the future. When I returned to my seat, I felt drained but also oddly relieved. I had said what needed to be said without malice or vindictiveness, speaking truth without cruelty. Brooke's statement to the court was brief and carefully scripted, likely the product of extensive coaching from her defense team. She expressed remorse for her actions, acknowledged the harm she had caused, and asked for the court's mercy in considering her mental health issues and lack of prior criminal history. "I know that saying I'm sorry can never undo what I did," she said, her voice barely audible in the large courtroom. "I destroyed my family and hurt the person I was supposed to love and protect. I understand that I need help, and I'm committed to getting the treatment I need to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Judge Hoffman deliberated for nearly an hour before returning to deliver Brooke's sentence. The courtroom was completely silent as she spoke, every person present understanding that these words would determine the trajectory of multiple lives. "Ms. Castellanos," Judge Hoffman said, looking directly at Brooke, "your crimes represent a profound betrayal of the most fundamental bonds of family and trust. You didn't act in a moment of passion or under immediate provocation. You planned, prepared, and executed an attack using biological weapons against your own sister." She paused, consulting her notes before continuing. "While the court acknowledges your mental health issues and lack of prior criminal history, these factors cannot excuse the severity of your actions or the danger you pose to society. The use of ricin as a weapon represents a level of sophistication and premeditation that requires serious consequences." Judge Hoffman sentenced Brooke to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, followed by 5 years of supervised release. The sentence was longer than the defense had hoped, but shorter than the maximum penalty she could have received. As court officers led Brooke away for the final time, she turned to look at our family one last time. My parents were crying quietly, mourning the loss of a daughter who was still alive but would be effectively gone for the next quarter-century. I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and something that might have been closure. The months that followed were devoted to the slow and difficult process of rebuilding our lives. Tyler and I moved to a new apartment across town, seeking a fresh start in a space that wasn't haunted by memories of wedding planning and hospital visits. We began couples therapy to address the trauma we had both experienced and to strengthen our relationship against the ongoing challenges of recovery. My relationship with my parents evolved in ways I hadn't expected. The trial had forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our family dynamics, including the ways that favoritism and competition had contributed to Brooke's psychological deterioration. We began family therapy sessions that were often painful but ultimately healing, learning to communicate more openly about difficult emotions and family history. I also threw myself into advocacy work, becoming involved with organizations that supported victims of family violence and domestic terrorism. The experience of being betrayed by someone I trusted completely had given me insights into the unique trauma experienced by victims of intimate crimes. 6 months after Brooke's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison. The envelope had been opened and inspected by prison officials, and the letter itself was written on standard institutional paper in Brooke's familiar handwriting. The letter was surprisingly thoughtful and introspective, lacking the self-justification and victim mentality that had characterized her earlier communications. She wrote about her therapy sessions, her growing understanding of the psychological factors that had led to her crime, and her genuine remorse for the harm she had caused. But what struck me most was her acknowledgement that forgiveness wasn't something she expected or deserved. She wrote that she understood the magnitude of her betrayal, and that she didn't expect our family relationships to ever be repaired. Instead, she focused on her commitment to using her time in prison productively, pursuing education and therapy that might help her understand and address the issues that had led to her criminal behavior. I read the letter several times before showing it to Tyler and my parents. After extensive discussion and consultation with my therapist, I decided not to respond. While I appreciated Brooke's apparent growth and self-reflection, I wasn't ready to engage in ongoing communication that might complicate my own healing process. A year after my wedding day, Tyler and I held a small ceremony to renew our vows and reclaim the celebration that had been stolen from us by Brooke's actions. The event was intimate and private, attended only by our closest friends and family members who had supported us through the darkest period of our lives. Standing in the same venue where I had been poisoned exactly 1 year earlier, I felt a mixture of emotions that would have been impossible to predict during those terrible early days. There was sadness for what had been lost, anger at what had been stolen, but also gratitude for what had survived. Tyler's vows brought tears to my eyes as he spoke about strength, resilience, and the power of love to overcome even the most devastating betrayals. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about learning to trust again, about the difference between healing and forgetting, and about the choice to build a future that honored our pain without being defined by it. The cake at our renewal ceremony was simple and elegant, cut without ceremony or fanfare. As Tyler and I shared the first bite, I felt none of the fear or anxiety that had plagued me in the months following the poisoning. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: pure, uncomplicated joy. 2 years after Brooke's sentencing, I established the Castellanos Foundation, a non-profit organization focused on supporting victims of family violence and providing resources for early intervention in cases of domestic terrorism. The foundation's work was deeply personal, but also served a broader mission of preventing other families from experiencing the kind of devastation that had torn ours apart. The Foundation's first major initiative was a research project examining the warning signs of familial violence and the psychological factors that can lead family members to commit serious crimes against each other. Working with universities and law enforcement agencies, we developed training materials for recognizing and addressing the early indicators of dangerous family dynamics. I also began speaking publicly about my experience, sharing my story at conferences and workshops focused on victim advocacy and domestic terrorism prevention. The speaking engagements were emotionally challenging but also therapeutic, allowing me to transform my trauma into something that might help others avoid similar experiences. During one particularly memorable presentation at a national law enforcement conference, an FBI agent approached me afterward to share his own story of family violence. His brother had threatened him and his family after a dispute over inheritance, and hearing my story had helped him understand that family relationships didn't automatically guarantee safety or loyalty. I always thought that because we were brothers he would never really hurt me, the agent told me. Your story helped me realize that I needed to take his threats seriously and get my family to safety. Conversations like that one reinforced my belief that sharing my experience, however painful, could serve a meaningful purpose in helping others recognize and address dangerous family situations before they escalated to violence. 3 years after my wedding day, Tyler and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Hope. The choice of name was deliberate and symbolic, representing our commitment to building a future defined by possibility rather than trauma. Holding Hope in my arms for the first time, I felt a profound sense of completion and renewal. She represented not just our love for each other but our faith in the future, and our determination to create something beautiful from the ashes of our painful past. As I looked down at her tiny face, I made promises that went beyond the typical parental commitments to love and protection. I promised to raise her with an understanding of both the beauty and the fragility of family bonds, to teach her that love requires both trust and boundaries, and to help her develop the emotional intelligence and communication skills that might prevent the kind of toxic dynamics that had destroyed my relationship with Brooke. The question of whether Hope would ever know her Aunt Brooke remained unanswered and complex. Brooke still had more than 20 years remaining on her sentence, and even if she were eventually released, the question of whether contact would be safe or advisable would depend on factors that were impossible to predict. For now, I was content to focus on the family we were building together, on the love that had survived betrayal, and on the hope that had emerged from our darkest moments. The sister who had tried to poison me on my wedding day had taught me painful lessons about the complexity of human nature and the fragility of trust. But she had also taught me about resilience, about the power of truth to overcome deception, and about the possibility of healing even the most devastating wounds. The perfect wedding day I had planned so carefully was gone forever, replaced by something more complex but ultimately more meaningful. A life built on the understanding that love is a choice we make every day, not a guarantee we can take for granted. Standing in my kitchen 5 years after the poisoning, watching Tyler chase our daughter around the living room while she giggled with pure delight, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again: gratitude. Not for the trauma we had endured, but for the strength we had discovered, the love we had protected, and the future we had chosen to build together despite everything that had tried to tear us apart. The sister who had poisoned my wedding cake had intended to destroy my perfect day and my perfect life. Instead, she had taught me that perfection was an illusion, but that real love, real trust, and real healing were possible even after the most profound betrayals. In the end, that was a gift I hadn't expected, but had learned to treasure. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.